Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone. I'm Bill Carney, co-chair of Time to Lead on Climate and president of Sustainable San Rafael.
And welcome everybody. I'm Belle Cole, co-chair of Time to Lead on Climate and chair of organizing for Action in Marin.
And today we're pleased to present how the Earth wins this election. It's a topic that seems to become more urgent every day.
Time to Lead on Climate is a coalition of 14 climate and environmental groups and here in Marin County. And we have a website, leadonclimate.org, and for links to all of our groups, where you can find out the many ways that you can join in working on the monumental challenge of climate change, including specific election actions and resources. You'll all find links to the 5 previous climate events that these organizations have put together.
So today's virtual event is new territory for us. We're inviting your participation by sending in questions via the Q&A link at the bottom of your screen. Our guests will be answering a few of those after they conclude each of the topic going through the afternoon. We'll also be using Zoom's pop-up poll tool to ask you a few questions about how you're planning to help the Earth win this election. So please join in and please bear with us.
So we're honored today to hear from 3 climate leaders, true climate leaders in the fields of government, science, and health. And before we begin, we really want to dedicate this event to the iconic Ruth Bader Ginsburg for her motivating us to be strong and to be activists. First, let me introduce Representative Jared Huffman, who represents California's 2nd District and spanning from the Golden Gate Bridge to north to the Oregon border. And he chairs the Natural Resources Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife. And Congressman Huffman is a member of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, and we'll be discussing his work this afternoon.
We're also going to be hearing from Dr. Natasha DeJarnett. She's the Interim Associate Director of Program at the National Environmental Health Association, where she leads research on climate and health, as well as children's environmental health. Dr. DeJarnett is an adjunct professor at George Washington University. She's a member of the EPA's Children's Health Protection Advisory Committee, as well as being on the governing boards of Citizens Climate Education and Physicians for Social Responsibility.
And our 3rd panelist is Professor Daniel Kammen, a distinguished professor of energy in the Energy and Resources Group at the University of California, Berkeley, and is a former science envoy for the State Department. He served as coordinating lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, which won the Nobel Prize in 2007. Dan is also a consummate climate conversationalist, and we're deeply, deeply appreciative that he's agreed to apply that skill in moderating today's discussion. So Dan, please take it away.
Well, my thanks to everyone for being on, for the organizing committee, Representative Huffman. It's really an honor to get to do this with you. And you'll hear a bit later a conversation with Dr. Natasha DeJarnett, which is really exceptional, looking at health, social and racial justice. But I'll begin with the obligatory, but I think always critically important comments on where we are in terms of the climate crisis. Everyone in Northern California has seen the really horrific events of the fires, but we need to put those in a little bit of context. The fires that California is experiencing both in the north and the south today, also going on in Oregon and Washington state as we speak, are actually emblematic of what we unfortunately expect to see and have expected for some time to see in a changed climate. In fact, last year it was the fires in Australia that scorched a good 5% of the continent, killed billions of animals. And earlier this year, we saw unprecedented heat waves over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 42 degrees Celsius in Siberia. We've also recently seen massive ice loss from the Antarctic and from Greenland. And all of these events are exactly the sorts of change that we expect from climate. Of course, in our current state, it's climate and it's COVID. And the degree of intersecting and amplifying crises is really one of the critical parts of the story. And so when we look at our lack of reliance on what science has been teaching us at the federal level, when we look at the inability to recognize that our choices around housing and transportation and smart agriculture are all things that we need to do differently, not only from a climate perspective, but from a justice and equity perspective, we really dig into the reasons why I'm so grateful for the work that Representative Jared Huffman is doing. As you'll see in a minute, what the House Select Committee has done is really put a bullseye on not just the issues that I'll say a few minutes about now to launch us, the climate crisis, but how so many of the things that we can do to make a healthier climate are also ones that promote social equity, promote resilience in our communities, our electrical system, our water system. And so solving climate is not a standalone crisis. It's in fact symptomatic of how to really change our equation. But when we look at the climate science in front of us, we're seeing record levels of methane release as we warm the tundra, a greenhouse gas which has a shorter lifetime but is far more potent, many times more potent than CO2. Anyone who's watched either Chasing Coral or Chasing Ice has seen examples of how quickly this change can happen, something that decades back, the sentiment was this is a slow moving change. Now we're seeing not only those dramatic movies, but also the degree to which political choices can be disastrous. In Brazil, President Bolsonaro has encouraged burning in the Amazon, which not only is burning forests directly, but is having feedback effects so that the Amazon and now the Congo Basin, places that were sinks of CO2, are now sources because we're changing the weather patterns. Here in California, the fires of just the last few weeks have actually equaled to be about a quarter of the state's annual emissions, and that's from the 5th largest economy on the planet. So the degree to which these compounding effects can completely change our story are both dramatic, and there are features that clearly show us that climate change is with us now. It's not 5 years, 10 years, 15 years away. And just as with COVID, what we're also seeing is that while we might all be in the same boat, we don't all have the same paddles. The degree to which we are not able to respond in the poorest communities, those that don't have or cannot afford air conditioning, those that are not served by public transit, those that do not have locally available food because the fancier grocery stores are in other communities, all of these features that we didn't used to think of in the climate context are now made far worse by our inability or our unwillingness to respond to not only the inequality in society, but the degree to which that inequality, those racial and socioeconomic injustices, feed back on the climate story. So as we think about issues that we might have previously thought as separate, COVID-19, Black Lives Matter, the inability to rein in police forces, our inability to invest in transportation that makes affordable, carbon neutral transportation available to the least well-off in the community, those are all features that really highlight the degree to which we have a problem. Today, however, with that context, we have a chance to really talk with and learn from what Jared Huffman and the House Select Committee is doing, and what's coming in terms of the platforms that we've seen from the Democratic candidates that have really built towards a truly transformative picture of how we can address climate issues. Those are all on the topics for our conversation today. So without going any further, I'd like to both re-welcome and thank my friend, Representative Jared Huffman, for joining, and to launch into just a little bit of the back and forth that'll both motivate our conversation, but also put some of the questions that are coming up in context. And so just to start us off, if you could give us an overview of the mandate and the status right now of the House Select Committee, that will get us going in this conversation.
All right, well, let's do that. But first, let me say that Professor Kammen, it's an honor to be in this conversation with you and part of this great panel. My thanks to Belle and Bill and the organizers of this event for their passion and long-standing leadership on these issues. They've pulled together many events that I've been fortunate to be a part of over the years, and they just keep doing it. And since we haven't yet solved the climate crisis, we may need them to continue doing it. So I'm very grateful for that. And just a quick word about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. You know, there's so much to appreciate in her great life and the contributions she's made as a jurist. But I think one of the things I appreciate most is the way she embraced her status as an icon for young women and girls all over this country. My own 20-year-old daughter, one of those who was inspired by the example of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And I think we will have generations of powerful, successful, incredible women that do great things because of the work that this amazing woman did and the example that she set. And there's no better part of that example than her final months working literally right up to her death, knowing she was battling cancer, but trying to get us as close as possible to the finish line because she knows what's hanging in the balance here. Climate change being just one of many of these, as you described it, Professor, intersecting crises. And I think Ruth Bader Ginsburg understood that very, very well and did her part to get us very close to that finish line. It is now, I think, on us to take this and run and do our part and not let her down. So I just wanted to offer that bit of personal context for the moment that we're in, and I'm happy to follow your lead as our moderator. Thanks for having me, everybody.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. So yeah, if we could start with the committee and maybe just one bit of context first. California's climate plan is kind of an instructive place to go. Our plan is to get to zero carbon by 2045, something we'll talk about later on. California might move forward because of things happening federally. But our plan has milestones along the way. It was to get to 1/3 of our energy from renewables by 2020, something which we're well over in the 37–38% range now, on a path to hit 60% in 2030. And those goals, the state has worked on through a whole variety of levers. So if we could think now about what's on your plate for the House Select Committee, it allows to go back and forth between what's happening locally and some of the visions at the national level.
Yeah, so let me just back up and tell you about the Select Committee's mission, how we came to be real quickly. I was able to travel in December of last year to the COP25 climate conference in Madrid with Speaker Pelosi and the delegation that she had pulled together. And this was in 2018. She made it clear that she wanted to create this Select Committee. She wanted me to be on it. And she gave it a broad mission. I mean, the high water mark for action in the United States Congress on climate was the Waxman-Markey bill a decade prior, which didn't look at the entire economy. It just largely looked at the energy sector. And we know that 10 years later, the IPCC has put a much more specific challenge in front of us. We've got to decarbonize the entire global economy. And we can't just grab this sector or this tool. So here we are. And we spent the better part of a year and a half having hearings and meetings at the Select Committee led by our chair, Kathy Castor of Florida, to develop what is now out and public, a 500+ page report that does that, something Congress has never done, looks at the whole of the economy, the whole of government, and makes recommendations across every sector. And it tries to get us to It identifies the path forward to get to net zero emissions by 2050 and to put us in position to go negative after 2050, because as you know, Dan, that's what the science says we're going to have to do. We have not yet invented some of the things that we will need to do that second half of the century work of going negative on carbon. But I think this is a great blueprint at an interesting time, because it converges with a presidential climate action plan that is very bold. It converges with the American people showing through polling that they're ready to go. And obviously this election is an enormous crossroad for us. Do we want to do this? Do we want to go there? Because the Trump climate plan is pretty clear. It's basically to go in the other direction as fast as he can take us there. And that brings us to a very, very historic choice right now.
No, that's right. And I think that it's really instructive that there are times in the US past when we really did double and triple down on innovation and deployment. And what you see in the international process, the meeting in Madrid where we both attended last year, is a mixture of needing to both innovate for the technologies we don't have, such as the ones to actually draw carbon down in the system, and those that we know are now shovel ready or near shovel ready, tested out by places like California with our pre-existing 2045 goal to go carbon neutral. And we've been joined in that by New York State, very significant economy, of course, Hawaii and Washington State and New Mexico, all of which are really at the leading edge of deploying more solar, more energy efficiency, geothermal power, offshore wind and wave energy. All of these fit together. But the mixture of doing research on new topics, such as through federal agencies like ARPA-E, the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Energy, and deployment, which the federal government can push, but much of that happens at the state level. That, again, is not just something that sounds great on paper. It's something that the committee really has bought into, and your report highlights many of those. I'm wondering if you might just highlight a couple of things that are most exciting to you in terms of that push and pull between the new research we need, the jobs we know it will generate, and the follow-on effects that will happen at the state and local levels.
Sure. Well, you mentioned ARPA-E, which is, of course, a very successful kind of incubator of innovation through the Department of Energy. And, you know, there's a military component of that too, DARPA, where we have kind of financed startups. And, you know, the famous failure, of course, Solyndra, was one of the rare failures of ARPA-E. Most of these startups that we encourage through federal upfront funding were quite successful, far more successful than the private venture capital batting average that you would see. So it's been a great way for us to drive breakthroughs in efficiency and renewables. And this report definitely embraces that model. One place where we could do it, we must do it, is in agriculture. So you and I have talked about this, Dan. What we really need is an ARPA-A for agriculture to take the food systems and rangeland management and other aspects of agriculture in this country that are currently part of our climate footprint. They're net emitters, but we know through research and best practices and things that are being demonstrated on the ground, including here in Marin County, that with the right strategies, we can make that part of the drawdown toolbox. And so that's one. We looked at natural systems in I think a really robust way in this report. That's timely because we're, you know, breathing rotten air from these fires, and we're thinking about forest management and all of that urgency. So again, healthy forests can also help us be safe from fire and sequester carbon. And so all of that is in the report. It's going to take a partnership, certainly, between the federal government and states and private forest landowners and others, but I think we're pointing in the right direction.
No, I agree with you. Now, when you and I first started working on these kinds of issues decades ago, the clean energy options were not cost effective at that moment, head to head to fossil fuels. We talked a good talk about how they would evolve. We're now in that world where last year and this year and the year before, 2018, 19, and 20, solar and wind projects have been the cheapest anywhere in the world. Those are the least cost projects. No footnotes about subsidies, no anything. So when you look at plans like this, everyone immediately turns to the financial bottom line. And we'll talk a little bit more about Vice President Biden and Senator Harris later on. But when you talk about the $2 trillion that they plan to spend and leveraging up to $5 trillion in total with private sector, some of the numbers that come out of what the benefits this will be at the local level are on the order of $8 to $9 to $10 trillion in terms of health benefits, benefits of our communities and schools. Can you just say more about how that calculus evolves in the committee? Because obviously, a conversation we might have in Northern California is quite different than we might have in Arkansas or other parts of the country. So I wonder how you kind of see the different levers fitting together in the work of the Select Committee.
Yeah, one of the things we wanted to do was put our climate action plan through a model because you always hear from Republicans and climate deniers that it's a trade-off. You have to sacrifice economic growth and jobs if you're going to do all this climate problem solving. And what the model showed is it's actually not that way, that there's an enormous upside and savings. Certainly savings when you look at the avoided impacts of allowing these worst case scenarios to continue to unfold. But the economic upside of the jobs that will be created, the new industries that will be spawned from some of these things, and then the health benefits, they're the ones that really drove the dollar figures in the model. You are going to make people healthier, you're going to save lives, and so we're trillions of dollars to the upside by pursuing these strategies rather than the other way around, which is, kind of the old canard that we're constantly told.
I'm going to do a thorny one now, and then we'll come back and chat after we do a focus on health. But some of the questions that we're getting already are great. One of which is, why not push more aggressively on fracking? And I have my own answer. I'm from upstate New York, where fracking is going on. It has water impacts. It has some job stories. But what's the committee's perspective?
Here's the far more important issue. Fracking is just a technique for developing natural gas that then gets burned, and a lot of it gets leaked. And yeah, it creates a huge methane problem that's an enormous part of our climate problem. I don't really care how you get the natural gas out of the ground. I just want to start leaving it in the ground. And I want to move on to clean energy. So to some extent, I think fracking is the shiny object that we all get excited about and talk about, but it misses the bigger point. We got to get off fossil fuel. And natural gas is awful, awful stuff. No matter how even if you ban fracking tomorrow, if we continue this over-reliance on natural gas, when you add up all of the leakage from the wellhead to the transmission to the burning and flaring and everything else, natural gas is no cleaner than coal. I think most of the newer analyses are beginning to show that leakage makes it every bit as bad as coal. So, let's move beyond frack, don't frack, and let's go after natural gas.
Yeah, and that's really been my perspective too, because as we talk about moving the goal from California's 2045, now Vice President Biden has set 2035, that gives us 15 years. And that means that if we really do this in a smart way, we tilt the market towards green, towards our own health, but we allow all fuels to compete in, recognizing that anything you do now that is a fossil fuel emitter is going to have to be out of the equation from energy generation by 2035. So I just don't see personally fracking surviving, even though I'm from a town, Ithaca, New York, where it gets talked about all the time. One of the features that has gotten a lot of attention has been this issue of how do we not only launch the green technologies, but how do we do so in a way that has social benefits, that we invest in low-income communities, minority communities. And one of the things that I thought was most exciting about the Select report was that it took this on. It really highlighted. If you can highlight, maybe your couple favorites here. And again, if we get cut off and the video starts, we'll just pick it up afterwards as well.
Yeah. So thanks for bringing that up. We had to do this. I mean, if we were to produce a climate action plan that didn't include a massive emphasis on frontline communities that have borne the brunt of climate pollution, as well as our inequality problems in this country, we would really be missing the moment, and it just wouldn't fly. So we not only talk a lot about the co-benefits of many of these strategies, but we talk about the need to actually put those frontline communities at the top of our priority list as we solve the climate crisis. So that means making them first in line for investment and jobs and the co-benefits of clean air and healthier communities. We know that in some places that are reliant on fossil fuels and royalties, that we're going to need to really work with them on a just transition. And you got to be real careful with how you do that, because I think we all want to price carbon in any way we can, and I'm for aggressively pricing carbon. But if you're going to create new royalties and mechanisms that turn around and go back to some of those frontline communities, that sounds like a nice, elegant solution, but you can create a new generation of dependency on fossil fuel revenues. And we got to break that dependency. As environmentalists, you know, one of our greatest programs is the Land and Water Conservation Fund, but it is funded entirely through offshore drilling royalties. And at some point, if we're going to continue to invest billions in public lands and trails and parks and all these wonderful things, we've got to replace that revenue stream. So it's a complex set of issues, but certainly the statement of principles is strong. I think there's a lot of really good specific ideas on how we can keep faith with these frontline communities and with our principles. And it's just a huge, huge theme all through the climate action plan, as it should be.
And just to kind of follow on that, when I was working for a while in Norco in Louisiana, which is basically a minority-dominated community wrapped around a series of oil and gas refineries. And while they saw cancer clusters, they saw hotspots of illness and disease, they also recognized that the jobs were at that point coming from those industries, and that Louisiana was not at that point a leader in thinking about renewables, although now we're starting to see offshore wind and other technologies ramping up. And so the numbers are kind of striking. The total annual global subsidy for fossil fuels is between $500 billion and $5 trillion a year, depending on whose accounting you do. Total annual investment globally in renewables is about $250 billion. So total investment versus just the subsidy side is really out of whack. And again, it's why what the committee's done in terms of highlighting the many places, smarter agriculture, rebuilding inner city communities, investing in public transit, making electric vehicles more accessible. All those things really rebalance it, and at least from my perspective, mean that more and more communities can see the opportunity that jobs and employment in clean energy have a very clear path to replace that missing fossil fuel sector. Those jobs are not going away. They'll be transitioned to green jobs.
Yeah. We've got to make them good paying green jobs. And that's part of our challenge going forward too, is it's easy to say to the refinery worker, to the oil field worker, you know, well, you can become a solar technician, but right now it doesn't give you the same kind of money. And so we got to make sure as we move forward that we support unionization, that we support high wages, high standards in this new green economy, because we want it to replace all of that.
Yeah, so I think we are ready for the video now. So we'll do a focus on health, climate, and justice, and then we'll come back to the conversation. So Natasha, it's really a pleasure to be on with you. I'm a physicist by training and work on energy and its impacts on health. And so here in California, we think a lot about not only the impact of wildfires, the layering of impacts of COVID on people, on communities of color, on different people in the workforce and people working in Central Valley in California in agriculture. And we're obviously seeing, you know, the COVID crisis layered on climate as not just an environmental insult one after another, but also a series of failures in our ability to respond to each of these individually. And I don't know if that's kind of the same world that you feel you're living in, but I'd love just to begin with, you know, what you feel is the COVID air quality interaction in terms of how we think about the crisis we're in.
Absolutely, Dan. I think you hit the nail on the head. We are in the midst of concurrent disasters all at once. We're seeing hurricane events, we're seeing the wildfire events, and this is all at the same time. We're in a global pandemic. When it comes to air quality, I think that has been one of the more interesting aspects of the relationship with COVID and environment. We've long known that cities with higher air pollution have higher deaths, and then also that people that are in areas with dirtier air have shorter life expectancies. There's also research that long-term pollution exposure increases the mortality risk associated with pneumonia, another viral disease that affects the lungs. So now insert COVID. This is why it wasn't quite unexpected when Dr. Francesca Dominici and her team at Harvard University identified that just a 1 unit increase in fine particulate matter was associated with an 8% increase in COVID mortality, meaning that more polluted cities were more likely to have COVID mortality or higher rates of COVID mortality. So COVID, on top of the air pollution aspect of it, has also laid bare some key health disparities, like people of color are more likely to die from COVID. People that have chronic conditions like asthma, heart disease, diabetes, obesity, they're also more likely to have death associated with COVID. So all these same populations are also more susceptible to climate change. So more susceptible to COVID, more susceptible to climate change. So we can't just look at the air pollution aspect of COVID mortality on its own. We've also got to look at that with an overlay of race.
We see the same thing. We have historically African American and Latino communities in some of the coastal areas that already had much inferior health outcomes, shorter life expectancies, more hospital visits, using emergency rooms as their primary care. And now when you layer COVID on, and that PM 2.5, that particulate matter of 2.5 microns or less size, which we record very carefully in California, both in the cities and Central Valley, we are now not only seeing the health impacts of that, but we're also seeing the layering you mentioned, where it looks like COVID may be able to ride on those fine aerosols. And so you get this interaction of effects going back and forth. And it's one of the scary things, from forest fires to how are we going to build back better? How are we going to put our new resources into, whether it's stimulus money or pre-existing state or community money, into actually building safer housing and building better quality resources. That feels like, to me, the big, mental win we could get out of learning a very painful lesson from COVID that we can apply to climate change. I don't know if that's kind of how you're looking at it, but that's our silverest lining in this horrific cloud right now.
I hope that our experience right now, though unfortunate, though we have a significant number of deaths, will give reason to prioritize environmental health, to see how it is interconnected with all of the crises that we are facing today, prioritizing action to protect health as our environments can be conducive to the spread of these, like COVID. COVID requires environmental health solutions. It requires sanitation. It requires disinfection, and it's spread by the air.
We're lucky away in California because we already have a price on carbon. It's in the market. We use it for our larger emitters. But on the economic side, there's a lot of discussion about the social cost of carbon, which by our estimates would probably be more like $50 a ton, whereas in California our price is about 20. And my hope is that one of the real advances we can get is to recognize, caught up in that difference between the market price and the social cost, we can start to recognize the impact on communities of color, essential workers, the people who are at the front lines and whose burden of impact from all this is so much higher. So we look at everything from the wildfires to what storms will do as one burden after another. And again, the least invested in communities are getting the biggest chunk of this impact.
Once again, spot on, because the myth till now, or the myth may persist, that we can't afford to invest in climate solutions. This is going to be too expensive. We really can't afford to not invest in climate solutions. Climate is very expensive, and it is very expensive on our health. So I have an example for you as well. Philadelphia decided to invest in an extreme heat warning system. And this extreme heat warning system cost the city $210,000. And when they went back and did the research on the cost benefit, they found that there was a benefit, a health benefit of saving 117 lives. And they corresponded this with 468 million over a 3-year period. We can't afford not to invest in climate.
I mean, that's why I'm sort of surprised, and sort of surprised at my own community, the scientists who've worked on climate, because we've made a very technical argument about climate change and sea level rise and impacts on trees and things, and it's all totally valid, but it hasn't moved the climate debate to be a social movement. It's made it a nerdy conversation, a very good one, but it's left out all of these benefits. And so if I could jump to one that, we're both teachers at university, and over the last couple of years, something that's come up a lot is the mental health of faculty, staff, and students, and how little we've thought about, how little we've invested.
I appreciate us having dialogue around the mental health consequences because, like you said, they're often not a key part of the conversation. It's challenging enough to ensure that health is a part of the conversation. And generally when that is the case, it's physical health that people are talking about. But mental health is also burdened by climate change as well. What you just said reminds me of my conversation with my class just this week. We're coming to the end of our term, and students were reflecting back on what the last 10 weeks were like for them and what they've learned. And one student said, I'm experiencing a lot of grief about environment and climate hazards. And as he said that, another student chimed in and said, you know what, I started to feel that way as well. And another student, I started to feel that way as well. It can be very heavy on those of us that are learning about this field or those of us that are working in this field. So we need to keep each other uplifted and also know that when we feel that way, it's not unusual. And hopefully it can mobilize us to continue this great work that's needed. But then there's also the other side that you have shared, that people that have lived climate experiences also bear a heavy burden. And so people that are exposed to extreme weather and floods, they can have increased risk of stress, anxiety, PTSD, and depression. And then you look back at storms like Hurricane Katrina. There's been a lot of mental health research on Hurricane Katrina, and they found that nearly half, 49% of Hurricane Katrina survivors developed a mood or anxiety disorder, and 1 in 6 of the Hurricane Katrina survivors developed PTSD. So extreme weather can really make pronounced some mental health threats. In addition, extreme heat and extreme weather can also increase risk of depression, violence, as well as suicidal ideation or suicide. And extreme heat also can render inactive some medications, particularly psychotropic medications. Drought can also cause mental health effects. In one way, if we look internationally, drought can cause conflicts between countries. In addition, drought here in the US was associated, a widespread drought for about a decade in the Midwest was associated with a sharp uptick in suicides among farmers. The same is true globally. This has been reported in the country of India as well.
This again feels like this kind of cascading crises, but again, I think what you said before is so key, that the real lesson, at least for me, is that it's not that we should be ignoring one issue for the other, it's that we can't solve one without recognizing the other. We're not going to solve climate without recognizing COVID. We're not going to solve the environmental and social and racial injustice without recognizing how those play in here as well. So, I mean, one of my hopes going forward is that the work coming out of the Congressional Select Committee on Climate Change, there's certain to be a version of this that will emerge around COVID and other viruses, can really recognize the ways in which the strategies that are good for one are good for multiple of these issues.
Absolutely. Agree wholeheartedly. And investing in climate is investing in health. And we can have the best efforts and the best intentions and can still leave certain populations out. And it's because of the nature of the systems that are fueling our actions. But climate change has such a grave impact on equity, particularly health equity. It exacerbates health inequities. It furthers health disparities. It exacerbates economic inequities. It can widen educational gaps. And all of these through the ways that it impacts health. But when you look at historically over the life of these different populations and communities, they actually are quite resilient. They have overcome so much over centuries. However, climate change is a threat multiplier for populations that are especially sensitive to climate change. So we have older adults. They have pre-existing health conditions that may leave them at increased risk, and they might be more socially isolated to not receive the alert of the wildfires or to not receive the alert of the storms that are headed nearby. Children are extremely susceptible when it comes to climate change, much more so than when compared with adults. The World Health Organization has data and evidence that 88% of the global burden on climate change falls under children younger than age 5. This is a generational justice issue. We have people of color, we have impoverished communities. They're more likely to be on the fence lines of these industrial polluters. They have a higher burden of exposure and also maybe more likely to have those pre-existing illnesses that we were discussing. We have indigenous communities who are being very uniquely affected by climate change. They have these close ties to the land. They have cultural ties to the land. They have religious ties to the land. They have sustenance ties to the land. And climate is displacing our indigenous communities here in the US. We have undocumented residents that may not be able to act in the best interest of their safety. For example, if there is a call for evacuation, they may not feel safe evacuating or going to a storm shelter for fear of deportation or otherwise. And similarly, our LGBTQ population, they may not feel comfortable with storm shelters for fear of discrimination or worse. So we have some populations that are quite sensitive to these impacts. And just as you said, if even with our best efforts to doing right, if we don't have justice at the center of climate action, we're going to miss some of these key populations, and everyone is not going to benefit from said climate actions. I think that right now that calls for justice are being heard. I feel that this is on the center of many people's minds in the midst of the concurrent events that we are facing or concurrent crises that we're facing. A lot of people are driven now to take action to protect justice, to advance justice. So I do think that this is the right time. It's always the right time to do what is right. Quoting Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, it is the right time.
We cut her there right at that most awesome RBG Martin Luther King sort of quote. So I want to appreciate, but let me before we go into some of the economic side of it, Jared, you can just highlight some of the areas, some of the ways in which the committee and your thinking on this health climate story are evolving, and then we'll turn for about 10 minutes to some of the many excellent questions here we have on some of the economic side of the transition.
Well, you just heard some great examples of how these crises are interconnected, and I think I just want to associate myself with all of those excellent points. The committee talks about the public health side of this story. Bold climate action improves health outcomes. It improves quality of life for a lot of these disadvantaged communities. And so I think it's an important part of our narrative here. We need to make sure that people understand that we're not just taking away fossil fuel jobs. We're going to create new jobs. We do need to, as I said, commit to making them good paying jobs. But we need to have folks associate this transition with clean air and better health outcomes and all of the upsides that add up to trillions and trillions of dollars over the next several decades.
Yeah. And so can you say something about the Climate Safe California planning and process? I mean, we've learned a lot, some of it very painfully from the wildfires, from some of our lack of resilience, and how that thinking will manifest itself in terms of bills and actions.
Yeah. So I think, Dan, that's a reference to some state legislation that attempts to set some very aggressive interim goals that I totally support. And I know that the local climate leaders in Sonoma County in particular have been working hard on that. So great idea. Let's keep raising the bar on ourselves, even in California, where we're leading the rest of the country, because we have to. I mean, it's just that kind of crisis. And I think our California leadership is super important on all of those measures.
Yeah. And I know that obviously no one likes to see the blackouts we had and the battle that went back and forth between the regulatory offices, the California Independent System Operator, the governor's office. But one of the interesting things is that we saw when Californians were requested to save, that California essentially turned down the demand for energy about 5%. Now we know historically, you can't do that all the time. You can't just keep asking for it. You've got to find ways to build it into the economic base. You've got to reward individuals and companies for conserving, so-called demand side management. We often talk about this here in California, but it hasn't been for a long time part of the federal conversation. And these ideas about how we blend in energy efficiency and renewable energy in this transition, to me, that's one of these jobs multipliers. But I'd love to hear what your conversations have been.
It always used to be the sweet spot where we could find Republicans interested in talking with us and folks in industry, because efficiency, it's hard not to like efficiency. It sounds so conservative. I will tell you, things have changed with this Republican Party. I mean, start at the top. You've got a president who goes off on weird rants against water efficient toilets and efficient light bulbs, and talks about how it makes him look. That permeates. This is a cult. It's not really a party these days, and folks have sort of fallen in line. The Republican side of our select committee on the climate crisis set up its own webpage, and I thought it was really interesting that they chose kind of a light bulb as their logo for the Republican members of the select committee, because they used to support lighting efficiency standards, and now they don't. Every single year we have some of these guys, these same guys, running amendments and fighting for legislation that literally prevents the Department of Energy and the federal government from moving forward with efficiency standards that everyone else has just kind of moved on with and are no longer controversial. But in Tea Party circles, there's just a deep, deep ignorance on even things like efficiency that used to bring us together.
I mean, I have to admit, my favorite quote coming off the Republican side of the House is from a newly elected member who said, "I didn't come to Washington, D.C. to argue with a thermostat. I want to get things done. The thermometer is not my enemy. I'm going to have to admit it, so let's figure out some of the strategies." So one of the places where I feel like the campaign that Governor Inslee ran and some of the hearings that you had really focused on the opportunities that are available through carbon smart farming, through paying farmers to do verified negative carbon in soil. So you talk about some of the areas here, because these really do feel like opportunities to build partnerships with traditional red agricultural parts of the country.
Yeah, they really are. And we have farmers in Iowa and all over the country that are excited to be part of this kind of farming. So, some of it just involves best practices and healthy soil building and things that won't be that hard to do. Some of it will need that research and innovation you were talking about earlier. We need to look comprehensively at farm equipment, at the chemical inputs into agriculture, as well as these different practices. We need to look at the types of things we grow and the places that we grow them, so that we can, more thoughtfully develop food systems that are also part of the carbon solution. But more and more, we are finding interested partners in places that, where politically we need those allies. Democrats really haven't had much of a conversation with middle America and rural America in recent years. And this might just form this and universal broadband access are two of the best things that we have to bring, to revitalize that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, you highlighted the degree to which I know you feel, I also feel that we are dealing with a cult on the conservative side right now, which is a horrible thing to say about people who I don't always agree with, but we're at least reasonable colleagues. This feels like kind of an unreasonable moment in terms of the many benefits. And when I see study after study that highlights that for the same amount of money invested in renewable energy and efficiency, smart agriculture, you get not a few percent, but you get multiple more jobs out. I mean, that feels like the most bipartisan kind of pro-US opportunity. Do you think that some combination of universal basic income, carbon credits for individuals, some mixture of those policies has a sweet spot post Donald Trump?
Well, we're basically doing universal basic income now. We're doing it incrementally, sort of several months at a time, to try to get us through this incredible downturn. And we're doing it in a not very targeted way, where we're sending the same checks out to, Jeff Bezos and his family as we are to the folks that have actually been thrown out of work and are struggling in some cases. But, we probably are irreversibly moving down this path of some kind of basic income model as how we support people through this radical changing economy, and certainly this current economic downturn. The other piece of this that I find really interesting, Dan, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. We talked about how we've got to go negative after 2050. One of the ways that we can do that is through farming, carbon farming. That's the proven off-the-shelf technology right now that takes carbon dioxide out of the air. But we're going to have to rethink the way we grow our food, because we need food too. And some of these innovative vertical indoor farming models, and I've toured these things, and the numbers are just remarkable. The outcomes are great. It's clean food, it's healthy, it doesn't have chemical inputs, it's remarkably efficient. And if we can transform a lot of the highly inefficient acreage all over this country that is polluting, that is involving tilling and all sorts of other things that are bad for us, creates no biodiversity. I mean, every square inch of the Central Valley is cultivated and nuked with chemicals, and it's just a lousy way to farm if you got a better alternative. But I think we're going to have to reimagine where our food could transport it and distribute it all over this country. You could have these vertical farming solutions in every location so that there is no transportation and distribution. Every community grows its own food. So we're going to have to think, I think, very creatively about all that and how it fits together.
I mean, this is why I'm so excited about it. I mean, everyone's excited in the moment they're in, but as negative as things have been in the last 3 years, what we've learned in the last bit has been really quite dramatic. In California, we have this low carbon fuel standard, which is basically a carbon test that we apply to transportation fuels. And if gasoline is the baseline, then moving to electric vehicles is significantly better. Moving to a biofuel is a little bit better, but it allows a quantitative conversation about how much you gain. And so as we watch the price of renewables fall, and again, solar, wind, at 1 and 2 cents per kilowatt hour, so significantly cheaper than fossil fuels, you can now think about using that clean energy to do much more sustainable food. And as you say, you can do local food, you can do not only these vertical walls, you can also do marine-based food. And I've seen proposals coming out of the Naval Research Laboratory, the Navy, NGO groups, highlighting that we could be getting 30, 50 or more percentage of our food, both vegetable and animal-based protein, from the marine system, and actually return land to nature. We already have seen efforts to decommission dams, and to think that we might not just go from dirty energy to green energy, but also make this a process to give back to nature. I mean, to my mind, that's actually the real upside. And I see it not only in your committee report, but on the Senate side. The Environment Committee is also looking at these opportunities. To my mind, this actually means that we're talking about not just a jobs dividend, but a healthy, resilient Earth dividend in this equation too. And it's not just kind of fanciful. There's really concrete ways to do it.
No, there's some great ways in which we can just get better and do better by nature. That is in the report, the 30 by 30 goal, which is a global effort to preserve 30% of the planet and the ocean for nature. That is in the climate action report that we've produced. And of course, California is working on a state corollary of that 30 by 30 natural protection goal as well.
So let me jump onto another one that comes up a lot, which is transportation. And we saw a month and a half ago, Lyft said that they would transition their roughly 2 million drivers by 2030 to electric vehicles. And when I look at that, I'm sort of all for it, but I feel like a much more aggressive plan would have come from companies if they had the kind of leadership in the White House that you're talking about, because electric vehicles are cheaper to operate. They used to be more expensive per car. They don't have to be anymore. Lyft is offering to make them available at incredibly subsidized rates. Is there a American jobs, social, racial equity story in cleaner transportation when I look at like the Schumer clean cars for America? Is that a piece that's far off, or could that happen overnight?
Well, that can happen really fast. And the only reason it's not happening even faster is because this administration has decided to fight with California over our clean car standards. And we've lost some time there. And some, unfortunately, some players within the automobile community went with the administration instead of going with California. There's been a bit of a schism, but we're going to get that back on track. And the great thing about it, so my roommate when I'm in DC, one of my roommates is Dan Kildee of Flint, Michigan. And I've been to Flint and I visited some of these, these skeletons of what used to be incredible company towns and just massive car manufacturing facilities that are just sitting there. And I've seen what's left of the economy in a community like that when an industry just leaves town. That's a place where you sort of have the rail lines and everything else you would need to start manufacturing electric cars at a very high level, and it could bring those places right back to life. And these are frontline communities of color that would benefit for sure.
I mean, nobody thought that California would have a car manufacturing industry again. And it sounded beyond science fiction. And now we kind of take it for granted that you can launch this. When you look at what Ford and GM are doing, you can really see this as kind of a piece of the story. So I need to turn us a bit because we're getting closer towards the end, towards the actual title of today's event. And that is, how does the Earth win the election? So these individual bills, the different financial tools are certainly part of it. But one thing that I always see is that you can have great ideas and you can have enough of majority, but it also takes these kinds of partnerships across the aisle, across the country. Where do you kind of see that? And I guess whether you want to call it names or not, who are some of the Republicans or conservative Democrats who you would turn to under a Biden-Harris White House, not this cult we have today, but who would you kind of turn to really be innovative partners? Because we're not really going to get there, no matter how angry we are with the cult, if we don't find a way to build those types of stories.
Well, I certainly have a few Republicans that we can talk to and hopefully work with. I mean, Brian Fitzpatrick in Pennsylvania is at the top of the list. He has joined me on my bill to protect the Arctic refuge from drilling and joined us in opposing offshore drilling on the Atlantic and Pacific coast. The list is very short, Professor, I regret to inform you. And, for those that are pining away for the days when, John McCain and other Republicans used to be very interested in working on climate change, they're just not anymore. So I think we're going to need for the Republican Party to reimagine itself in the wake of Donald Trump. And I don't think I can do that work for them, or you can. I think they're going to have to sort it out. And it may take an election cycle or two before that gets resolved, because just because we win this cycle, and even if it's an overwhelming victory, Donald Trump has succeeded in capturing just about every aspect of that political party and making it his own. And they're not going to just go away. So, I am rooting for, the Mitt Romneys and the others that would like to take the Republican Party back to some place of what we thought of as normal. But it's going to take a while. And what I don't think, and this would be a critical mistake for us, is to just chase those Republican votes for years and years because we want something bipartisan. We don't have the time for that. We don't have the luxury of that. So I think what we've got to do is just do what the moment demands of us. Advance the policies that are necessary, the best ideas that we've got. And if we do it right, the American people are with us. There's going to be enormous pressure on Republicans to come on board. And if they don't, well, there'll be a price to pay on that side. But I'm not interested in just chasing Republicans for the sake of calling something bipartisan, if it means compromising on the imperative of solving this crisis. That's got to be job number one. And right now, I've just got hardly any Republicans that'll work with us on it.
But that's also why I feel that fee-bates, there are policy proposals that would essentially tax dirty technologies and give those revenues to people who buy clean technologies. The Clean Cars for America is one that is a job-producing opportunity. Better interstate commerce around clean energy, building our offshore wind industry to catch up to China and Europe. These are all really powerful job opportunities. And it strikes me that if you had a different leadership, if you had that Biden-Harris platform that had said 40% of all federal spending is going to go to low-income minority communities, we're going to invest there, we're going to make job creation co-equal with cleaning the planet. Because I personally think it's not just that you can't do one without the other, you wouldn't want to because you don't get all the benefits. And so that's where I feel like the blueprint you've laid out is, I want to see every branch of government kind of take on its share. And I guess one thing that might be worth highlighting that doesn't get discussed that much in the Biden proposal is that there would be a climate equity office, not only in the White House, but also in the Department of Justice. And there would be interagency efforts that link energy and housing and EPA all together. That's got to be something which does feel like high quality administrators, bureaucrats, as you say. Something I'd like to do is really an agenda that allows Republicans to get on board with this.
Yeah. Well, I hope that's the way it goes, but I think you can't compromise with climate reality and with science and some of these hard truths that form the imperative before us. We've just got to go and meet it and trust that the political pressure and common sense and a sense of responsibility will bring the Republicans along. But we don't have the luxury of chasing them or waiting for them right now.
So let me dig in on one more along this line, and that is that we do have a number of agencies at the federal level have arguably been underused. The FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. California, we know of it as the place that essentially sided against us in some of the efforts. We don't utilize them enough. The EPA is not cabinet level. There's a whole variety of changes that are not earth-shattering, but that would enable these features. And someone who crafts the laws, are there places you would start in terms of making the federal government both a partner with states and cities, frontline communities, but would also enable these operations to go much more smoothly? So the Republicans did have to catch up. They had to join because this is where the action is.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to codify a climate mission in a whole bunch of agencies that currently don't have that. In some cases, they have missions that are antithetical to our climate goals. Like the Bureau of Land Management right now is pretty much set up around an organic act and a mission that is to develop and exploit and extract. And there can be some of that, not on the fossil side, I would argue. It's time to shut that down. But there can be other types of commercial activity on some of these public lands. But we got to put renewable energy and climate solutions right into that mission. And that's going to need to be the case. You mentioned FERC. You can't just pretend that all electrons are the same. And it used to drive me nuts as recently as the Obama administration when I would hear Secretary of Energy Ernie Moniz, brilliant man, but he would talk about this all of the above energy. No, Ernie. that was like 20 years ago, maybe. All of the above does not work in this moment.
Right. Especially when we have an overabundance. I mean, we actually can pick and choose based on price and how clean. California, we have a loading order. We pick energy based on not only market price, but also on its carbon content or lack thereof. So it's not, doesn't feel that hard. We have excess generation in parts of the country. So I agree with you, we can do. So we've got 4 minutes before we're going to turn to the final polls. And I guess the big question is, how can people here both assist the committee, your committee, and how can it assist the broader effort where citizens to get out the vote for climate? What are some of the things as we're now, 44 days out? We are getting close.
So I'm going to suggest a two-part plan of action for all of us. Part one is let's not have any fights amongst ourselves for the next 42 days about anything at all, whether it's fracking or police defunding or anything you can think of. So we've really got to bifurcate some of our passions, I think. And for the next 42 days, be disciplined and focused and motivated by a combination of fear, because if you're not afraid a little bit in this moment, you're not paying attention. The stakes are really that high. But also incredible optimism because of the opportunities to turn this thing around and do some of the great things we're talking about. So it is okay to be simultaneously terrified and fired up and energized and also operational and focus like a laser beam on what you need to do. That's what it's going to take for the next 42 days. We'll all come together and work on holding Joe Biden accountable to this climate action issue. I'm going to do that as a member of Congress. I promise you we're going to work with Professor Kammen and a bunch of other folks during the transition to get good people in place. And then we're off to the races because we don't have a lot of time. But this election is the first thing. If we don't get that, it's game over.
I also feel that for people who are interested and sort of recognize the fear but are not excited, this is the most exciting energy, environment, sustainability platform since Carter. I love what happened under Obama. I served the administration, but this is what was codified then is nothing like what you're seeing now. So I'm really excited for, as you say, we have to win. Nothing else matters besides getting to that point. And then we have a really exciting agenda. So I think the other place is that it's the outreach of conversation. So one of my students, Kathy Kunkel, she's running after 10 years working on mountaintop preservation and communities in West Virginia. She's running for Congress in the 2nd District. That's the kind of place where if you have a friend or a relative, you really want to be reaching out to boost those, because that's the sort of landslide we need so we can get these things through and push new members of the House and Senate. What's exciting to me is there's people like Kathy running in Arkansas, running in Texas. Texas has not been in play before. I think it is in play now. So there are real chances to make this a victory election that can't be stolen by really having sweeping changes in states that you wouldn't think are on the agenda. So it's an exciting time for it. Okay, our hosts they'll tell us about the poll results.
Thank you all for filling out the poll, and you see the results there. With that kind of support, we're going to swing this election. Thank you very much for that. And I did want to put up one final slide that provides some resources that could help you in those efforts to really get out the vote and really continue the climate conversation. And then I'm going to ask Dan and Jared for a minute each of a final comment. So this is a slide that has a whole lot of information on it, much more than we're expecting anybody to absorb. But what we would like you to take away is that you can make a difference, and that all you need to do is go to our website at leadonclimate.org, and there is a list of links to all of these organizations and a lot more that can help you be effective climate activists in this critical election. So with that, I think we will turn it back over to Dan and Jared to wrap up with brief statements. Thanks very much, everybody.
So I'll do mine first. I can do under a minute. For me, it's exactly what Jared said, and that is that whatever your particular perspectives are, this has to be the election that you vote for the health of US and the planet. And I don't think we can get there without making climate protection and social and racial justice co-equal. My wife is African-American. I have 2 African-American daughters, one of which has experienced some real issues at college of racism. I think that you solve these together. And I think that we come out of this with that much stronger perspective that the country did a 4-year aberration, but we're back if we can win this one. For me, that is clearly the message here.
Yeah. Well, amen, Professor. It's been great to be in conversation with you. And let me just say, as I looked at the screen that Bill and Bill just posted, in the months ahead, if we can win this election, we're going to have some really interesting and spirited conversations about how to take these climate plans and put them into action. And we're going to have moderate Democrats and people from fossil fuel states, and they're going to probably challenge me in interesting ways. The fossil fuel industry will come at us with marketing campaigns like we have never seen to try to make it seem like they're on it. They got this. And there's going to be a million Trojan horses and tricks and all sorts of chicanery. We will have principal differences among ourselves on the climate action side of this about exactly how you price carbon, exactly how you regulate certain sectors. But none of it matters if we don't win this election 42 days from now. So let us keep our eyes on the prize. All that great stuff is going to come in due course. I haven't got my portal set up on Give Green yet, but within the next 24 hours, I'm going to be just blaring to all of you about the matching fund I've set up on Give Green, and I hope that's something that you'd consider. I think we've identified some other great ways in which people can do their part in this historic moment. We certainly cannot let RBG down because we've got 42 days. And we got a lot of stuff hanging in the balance. So appreciate being part of this action-oriented dialogue. Let's get to work.
Thank you all so much. Our panelists, the conversation, and where it's led. So we want to thank you, and we want to thank all of you for coming, and let you know that we are collecting the questions that you put in the Q&A and in the chat box, so that we will have a chance to get back to you on this. And any response you want to make to this event, let us know what you thought. And it was a real pleasure bringing everybody together, because it's such a short time and we have so much to do. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.